So the UK's immigration system and asylum system is in a bit of a mess. The UK government, quite dishonestly, has claimed that it's dealt with the backlog, of asylum applications, even though there are still about 100,000 people who are waiting to be processed. But also, Rakib, you wrote about two interesting cases that I want to draw attention to, suggesting that it's actually quite difficult to get rid of people who really shouldn't deserve asylum or shouldn't deserve protection in the UK. So there was an ISIS propagandist and an Albanian crime lord who we recently learned cannot be removed from Britain. Do you want to tell us a bit about this?
Totally remarkable. And I covered these two cases in a recent piece that I authored for us at Spike. So one was a man of Sudanese origin, an ISIS propagandist who had illegally entered the UK. Then he was granted British citizenship. Then fleeing from Sudan, apparently he returned to Sudan, where he peddled a great deal of this propagandist material on behalf of ISIS. And then the Home Office essentially attempted to strip him of his British citizenship. And this particular individual managed to sneak into Britain for a second time, which doesn't really say much about our border security. But what was all the more remarkable was that he was granted right to remain on human rights grounds, which is just utterly remarkable. And then you have people, including academics who specialize in security and intelligence, who have expressed how truly astonished they are by this judicial decision. And in another case, we have an Albanian crime boss, again, using provisions from the European Convention on Human Rights in order to remain in the UK. I think what this also, we know how dysfunctional the asylum system is, the fact that we're not able to provide sanctuary to people who are genuinely at risk of violence and persecution in their homelands. But it also shows, in my view, inadequacies when it comes to how people are being naturalised, the kind of individuals who are being able to acquire UK citizenship to begin with. So I think we have what we need really, and what I call for in our article, is systems level change, whether it's our legal immigration system, our dysfunctional asylum regime, but also tightening up the processes when it comes to citizenship acquisition in the UK.
Tom, I mean, it does just feel like absolutely no one, or at least no law-abiding person, is served well by the current mess. Because, as Rakib said, if you genuinely are seeking asylum, it's actually very difficult to get your case heard. I mean, actually, Rakib, you wrote about this, last year. There's the case of all these, Afghan interpreters or people who worked with the British Army who were soon to be persecuted who are being persecuted in Afghanistan. They can't get in. They have no special rights. British citizens aren't being served because, lots of people who are criminals are allowed in and can't be deported, seemingly. I mean, it just seems like the whole thing is a mess.
It's a complete mess. And it's also a big problem and should be recognised as such by people who do want, as I think we all do, a generous but also sane asylum system. This is becoming a complete block to that. People have no faith in the system whatsoever because it's become clear that it's sufficiently dysfunctional that it's become a route for sort of illegal migration in many respects, but also just a giant loophole which is being exploited by various nefarious characters, whether that be criminals or terrorists. Yeah. And that's not to suggest that your average asylum seeker is either of those two things, to suggest you shouldn't have a system which allows people to pose as asylum seekers in order to do harm or in order to, again, carry on in a way that we shouldn't want in this country or any country. I mean, it's so blindingly obvious to me. And yet there's this very nervousness about talking about the fact that, for instance, there have been a sort of string of terrorist attacks, not just in the UK, but across Europe, where people have either posed as asylum seekers in order to get into Europe. That happened with some of the people involved in the Paris attack. They were dispatched by ISIS across the Mediterranean because they knew that the checks would be insufficient so they could actually seek their way into Europe. And there's also been a string of cases where, because there isn't this level of security, because there isn't this level of monitoring, there have been cases in the UK, whether it's the Reading attack or the Parsons Green bombing and so on, the botched bombing in Liverpool.
Yeah.
So what was that, about a year or so ago, where these people were basically caught up in the asylum system or here legitimately, but obviously weren't being kept as close enough of an eye on to work out if they might pose some sort of security problem. It seems to me it doesn't matter how generous you want to be in relation to a question like asylum. This should concern you from a public safety perspective, but also from the perspective of maintaining public support for these programs, which there really is when the need is there. I mean, that's one thing that came up in the whole discussion about the Rwanda policy. When people really polled this, things like the rule about if you enter illegally, you should never be able to claim asylum didn't sit well with people because they could all think of these examples of someone who might have made that crossing because they had no other option. They might have been someone who worked with us in Afghanistan and so on. So there is that desire to be open for people, but at the same time, you're not going to be able to implement that, and you're not going to be able to overcome the clear concerns that do exist, nevertheless, if the system is this dysfunctional. And the fact that people on, say, the more pro side of the argument refuse to even engage in some of these discussions, I think is really alarming in that sense.
Definitely. And Rakib, I mean, one of the things that it keeps coming up, I'm not sure that this is entirely to blame, but one of the blockages, it seems, is the ECHR and the broader sort of human rights framework. I mean, it does obviously strike the vast majority of people that it's ridiculous that, say, an Albanian crime boss should, cannot be deported on human rights grounds or and things like that. Or the ISIS member that you mentioned earlier even has to be kept anonymous on human rights grounds. We can't even name this person, so his neighbours don't even know who he is.
I think it's such a, and it's good that you raised those points, because the man of Sudanese origin, the who was responsible for peddling pro-ISIS material, he's been granted lifelong anonymity. So people could be living very close to him, his own neighbours. They will have absolutely no clue about his terror-related history. The Albanian crime boss, the National Crime Agency, has said it is very likely that this particular individual is going to return to a life of crime. So these are people that they do pose a genuine threat to social order in the UK. I think in terms of the ECHR and also the 1951 Refugee Convention, people can talk a big game, and the Conservative Party certainly does, but there's a fundamental difference between the rhetoric and the reality. If they feel that we cannot foster and forge a human rights framework which ultimately prioritises the interests of the law-abiding majority, while the UK is a signatory to the European Convention of Human Rights or the Refugee Convention, which I believe that they were sort of finalised in 1950 and 1951 respectively. So there is a strong case for modernising those treaties and conventions. So they really need to campaign either that UK spearheads a process of modernisation, tries to cultivate international support for that, or they have to seriously entertain withdrawing the UK from those treaties and conventions if they genuinely believe that they cannot cultivate and foster a human rights framework for the UK, which ultimately prioritises the safety and security of the law-abiding majority in the country.
And Tom, I mean, it does feel like it's always the sort of non-democratic parts of the state that are in some ways the most dysfunctional or acting in the ways that are most, just so obviously anathema to public opinion and basic common sense.
And the two things have definitely gone in tandem, I think, which is the more that our migration policy has been kind of shaped by judges or lawfare, the more our migration policy has been something which politicians, whether they know it or not, are kind of force-fielding from any proper reform because they just gesture to the ECHR and say that nothing can really be done. And the more that the Tories have basically said one thing and done another on this, the more vexed the issue has become, but also the more dysfunctional our policy has become. I mean, anyone can recognise the issues that exist with some of the cases that we've been talking about. And yet, because there is either this fear of going there for fear of looking bad amongst the quote-unquote international community, or because of the fact that there's a lot of politicians, as Rakib was suggesting, who just don't really, they can talk a big game, but aren't really willing to dispense with the political capital to engage in the kind of hard-won reform that would be necessary to properly take back control of immigration policy. It just gets worse and worse and worse.
Yeah.
But I think the public are just not going to put up with it anymore. And I think it would do governments of whatever stripe well if they just started listening to what are so obviously just commonsensical problems with the system. But I'm not holding my breath in that regard.